Hello lovely people and welcome to my channel, and in this week's video I will be showing you how I draw this feathery flamingo. And I'm going to be using my Mission Gold watercolours, and I'm going to be trying a new technique, painting using negative space. So that's the space around the object you're drawing, and in this case more specifically the feathers of this flamingo. I'll also be talking a little bit about why I think it's good to try new techniques, and I'll also be mentioning the method that I used for the negative painting as I go through. So I have been watching a few videos on painting with this method and stumbled across a guy called Rick Sorowich, I think I've pronounced it right. I'll put a link in the card above. Now his paintings are truly amazing and I found them really inspiring and thought I would give it a go. So this is where I started. I drew a pencil outline just very lightly on my watercolour paper, and started off, the first step was to set a colour roadmap with your foundation wash. Now that's basically just picking out the colours that you want to use in the main part of your picture and making a really light wash using your watercolours, and I also used a spray bottle as well just to diffuse those colours out and make them blend nicely together. And once I'd done this, I then went in with some mid-tones to sort of create the main body of the flamingo, and here I'm just doing the neck and the head. So the roadmap that you've created with your foundation wash is what you then follow when you're adding your midtones, and you go from there to kind of build up your painting. So as you can see, I'm now starting to add the midtones to the body of the flamingo, and using the negative space is a really different technique, and it's a little bit tricky to get your head around. At least I found it so, because instead of drawing the feathers themselves, you are actually drawing the areas around the feathers, or painting in the areas around the feathers. And using this spray bottle to diffuse the colours, you kind of end up with a pale colour, a nice wash, and as the layers dry you go in and add darker colours. So you're just sort of outlining the areas and then using that spray bottle to diffuse the areas over the feathers rather than colouring them in individually as you might do normally. So you're putting those darker colours into the negative space areas, and then you're letting it dry and going back and repeating the process. And because watercolour is transparent, it really builds up some really nice layers and some really lovely effects. So in order to add some really great contrast and juxtaposition, it's a really nice idea to put your darkest colours next to your lightest lights. So you'll see a bit further down when I do the feathers, but just to sort of say that when you do the darkest colours, say like in the shaded areas, if you put them next to a highlighted or lighter area, it really makes that stand out. And that's what I really like about this technique, and it's quite sort of different to what I'd normally use, but I'm certainly going to be trying it again. This was my first attempt and it didn't turn out quite as soft with the feathers as I had imagined it to, but it was certainly a good first effort, I think, and as I say, I'll certainly be practicing it some more in the future. And I'm also using, after I've used the spray bottle, just to diffuse that colour, I'm blending in quite a limited palette actually, some sort of reds, oranges, and mixing those together to create the colours that I've got. And I'm just using a fairly standard round paintbrush to do this. I'm not using any fine detail brushes at this point. But I really like the way that the spray bottle diffuses that colour, and I also use a bit of kitchen roll or tissue just to mop up any excess water. And again, this is something I think that takes practice, just so that you feel confident that the painting's not running away with you and that the water and the paint are going where you want it. So that spray bottle does diffuse the dark colours and makes some really nice blends, and also brings the lighter areas forward. And towards the end of your painting, you can also, once it's dry, add like a transparent wash over the whole area just to add some more colour or a different colour dimension to it as well. And I did use a reference picture just as a guideline as well, and that's useful to be able to assess at the end whether you've got like the dominant shapes and you've got in some darks and lights to make a nice contrast. And you can also add things like plastic scrapers to kind of lift some of the paint up before it's completely dry, and that's really good to do when the paper is still drying at the sort of the glossy stage. You can also lift off linear shapes with a damp brush and give layers and shapes to strengthen the shapes that you've got. So it is just working that negative space and gradually building up your picture. So is it good to challenge yourself with new techniques? I really think it is, because you can always take something new and you can take it forward into your next painting. I also think it's really good to expand your knowledge of different painting styles, and knowledge is really great because it sort of forces you to have a look at things and different styles that you wouldn't normally have, and avoids you getting stuck in a rut with, even if your style that you've got already, even if you're really happy with it and you're really pleased with the work that you're producing, it's always good to expand those ideas and try something new. It also gives you the opportunity to see how others interpret different techniques and approach paintings in a different way, and I think that's always really useful. So I do think it's okay to stick with what your style is and what you know and what you're good at, but I think it's important for you to grow as an artist, for you to appreciate things that others do and different work that's out there. And certainly by giving it a go gives you an idea of just how differently you can work the same medium. So in this case, watercolour. And certainly gives you a chance to try out something you might not even have tried at all before. So you might not have tried watercolour before, and so by looking at different styles and different techniques and the way that different people work these different styles and techniques, you can certainly always learn something new. And I think as an artist you can never know everything there is to know, and certainly with this sort of technique it takes a bit of practice, and although the effect is really amazing, it's certainly not easy, and people who are watercolourists, and any artist really, can be studying and practicing for years before they perfect their techniques. So for me, even though my initial idea for this painting didn't quite turn out as it did, I think I'd wanted to do more of a soft feathered effect, but I think this style is good for a really dramatic effect, and I did really enjoy it, and I'll certainly, as I said, be trying it again in the future. So I would say don't expect to perfect it straight away. I think that's as much advice to myself as anyone else, certainly when you're trying new things, because yeah, these artists who have been doing it for a long time have had all that time to practice, and so me coming along thinking that I can do it straight away was somewhat optimistic. But I really enjoyed doing it, and I think it's a good first attempt. So I'm proud I had a go anyway, and absolutely not as easy as it looks. So as I'm going through the picture, I'm just bringing in some darker tones and putting those next to, as I said, next to the lighter, brighter areas. So I'm working in that negative space, so that's the space around the feathers, to create the depth and also a nice range of colours. And where I'm putting these darker areas in, it does really make those lighter areas stand out and really pop. So at the end here, I'm just adding a few more layers and darkening up certain areas. And the more that you progress your painting, the more that you see the contrast, or the more that you could put contrast into your painting. So that's why I'm just going over the neck again, just to add a little bit more colour to balance out the feathers and the darkness and brightness of the feathers that I used. And I think the only thing with this technique that I did find a bit tricky, or no, not the only thing, one of the things that I found really tricky was knowing where to stop actually, because it's a good idea from what I've looked at on other people's videos doing this style to get a really good contrast between lights and darks, but knowing when to stop and knowing when you've finished is something that I struggle with a little bit. And also with watercolour, the other thing is that it does dry a lot lighter. So once it's dry, it's kind of good to reassess, as I said before, reassess compared to perhaps your reference photo if you're using a reference photo, and just make sure that you've got enough darks and enough lights in there. And putting those darks next to the really light, bright areas really does help them to stand out. So the important thing before I finish is to make sure that the painting is dry before I add the black area of the flamingo's beak. And hopefully you've enjoyed watching my little experiment doing painting using negative space, and I'd really appreciate any comments. What do you think about this painting? Have you tried drawing using this method or this technique? And what do you think would be any advice or tips for me, or what other videos would you like to see in the future? So give it a comment, a thumbs up, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching guys, have a good week, bye.